Think for a moment about losing half the people in your town, maybe even your city. Just gone.
Yeah.
That was the brutal reality. In places like Paris, Florence, Hamburg, Bremen, London, back in the mid-14th century, the Black Death.
Mortality rates just soared,
Yeah.
upwards of 50% in those dense cities.
And the terrifying part, nobody really understood why
Mm-hmm.
or how to stop it. It just spread.
It's almost impossible for us today to truly grasp that scale of devastation. I mean, a demographic catastrophe
Right.
didn't just kill millions, it fundamentally shifted the course of history in ways we're still uncovering, really.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is about. We're not just looking at the grim origins, the relentless spread.
No, there's more.
We're exploring some genuinely surprising long-term consequences. Things like, well, how this one event might have subtly reshaped our actual genes centuries later, and maybe even played a role in, believe it or not, 20th century politics.
It sounds unlikely, but the research points there. We've looked at historical accounts, obviously, but also cutting-edge genetics, even studies linking plague intensity to election results.
Quite a range of sources.
Whoa.
So our mission today, cut through all that detail, get to the core insights, those aha moments connecting this distant past to us now.
Let's do it.
Okay, so where did this horror actually begin? The origin point.
Well, that precise origin, it's still debated, still under investigation,
Uh-huh.
Genetic analysis tells us the bacterium Yersinia pestis, it's ancient. But pinpointing the exact spot for this mid-14th century outbreak, it's tricky.
People talk about Central Asia.
China. Central Asia, China, the Middle East, even Europe itself have all been suggested as possibilities at different times.
Okay, so the spark is a bit murky, but its arrival in Europe, that seems clear. The Siege of Kaffa.
Yes, that's the generally accepted theory, backed by several accounts. Kaffa, a Genoese trading port in Crimea, 1347.
Right.
The Golden Horde army, Johnny Beg's army, besieging the city. The story goes they catapulted plague victims over the walls. Very. From there, the thinking is the disease hitched a ride. Genoese ships, likely via fleas on black rats.
The classic image. Rats, fleas, ships.
Yeah.
So once those ships dock,
Yeah.
how does it explode inland?
Well, the sea routes were definitely key initially, spreading it across the Mediterranean, North Africa, West Asia, then hitting Europe's ports, Constantinople, Sicily, Italy.
Uh-huh.
But what's really interesting, and there's strong evidence for this, is that once it landed, it also spread fast person to person.
Ah, not just the rats then.
Exactly, as pneumonic plague, the lung-based form. That
Right.
could explain the incredible speed it moved inland. Some argue it was just too fast for rat fleas alone,
That makes sense. Airborne transmission would just accelerate everything dramatically.
Absolutely.
And I read our sources mentioned some newer findings, potentially pushing the timeline back or suggesting different routes.
That's right. A 2022 discovery in Kyrgyzstan found evidence of a big surge in deaths from plague back in the late 1330s,
Before Kaffa then.
before Kaffa. That, plus ongoing genetic work, suggests the initial emergence might not be solely tied to the Mongol conquests of that century, as we used to think.
Look.
It hints at maybe earlier, independent outbreaks, maybe different routes into Europe.
Fascinating. So the story keeps evolving.
It does.
And this bacterium, Yersinia pestis, it wasn't entirely new, was it? It'd shown up before.
Correct. Research, relatively recent research, shows why pestis was in Europe and Asia way earlier, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age.
Wow.
There's even speculation it played a role in the Neolithic decline around 3000 BCE.
But maybe a different version of the bug.
Exactly. It's important to stress these were likely different strains. The evidence suggests flea-borne bubonic plague, the kind we associate with the Black Death, probably emerged later in the Bronze Age.
Okay, so the Black Death wasn't necessarily brand new, but maybe a particularly nasty strain or just the conditions are a perfect storm.
A perfect storm is a better way to put it, yes.
Let's talk more about transmission, that dominant theory of the fleas, Xenopsila chiapis.
Right, the oriental rat flea. The bacterium Y. pestis, it has this really unpleasant trick.
Uh-oh.
It can form a biofilm, basically a sticky mass of bacteria that blocks the flea's foregut, stops it swallowing properly. So when the infected flea tries to feed again, it can't take blood in effectively, and it ends up regurgitating bacteria back into the bite wound.
That is efficient and disgusting.
It ensures transmission very effectively.
But you mentioned alternatives or debates about this.
Yeah, while the rat flea model is, widely accepted, some researchers raise points. like the archaeologist Barney Sloan.
What's his take?
He points out that in places like medieval London, the archaeological record doesn't show the massive rat die-off you might expect if they were the main vector.
Interesting point. So what does he suggest?
He and others lean towards direct person-to-person transmission playing a bigger role than maybe we thought. Body lice, human fleas, especially for that pneumonic form.
Right, the airborne version again.
So the exact mix of transmission methods, the jury's still slightly out, you could say. There's ongoing discussion.
Okay. So however it spread, living through it must have been just terrifying. What were conditions actually like in 14th century cities? What allowed it to take hold so badly?
Oh, the hygiene. Or lack thereof, that was a huge factor. Germ theory was centuries away, right?
Yeah.
Sanitation was, well, incredibly basic, mildly put. In Paris, you had streets literally named after the waste piling up there.
Streets named after.
Yeah.
Wow, that really does paint a picture. A smelly one.
And it wasn't just human waste. You had livestock wandering freely in London, Paris, pigs, cattle, you name it.
Inside the city walls.
Inside the walls, homeowners were supposed to clean up dung, but often didn't happen effectively. Complaints were constant about manure smells, runoff from slaughterhouses, polluting streets, gardens.
On getting rid of waste from houses.
Often just shout a warning, "Guardy Lou," basically, and tipped the chamber pot out the window into the street below.
Unbelievable. The constant stench must have been overwhelming. Perfect breeding ground for disease.
Absolutely.
And the symptoms people suffered once they caught it. Not just a fever, I take it.
Oh no. The symptoms were horrific and varied. Systemic infection breaking down tissues, causing organ failure.
What could you see?
Visible signs included, well, wild, bloodshot eyes, a black coating on the tongue, a pale, wasted look to the face.
And neurological effects.
Frequent. Slurred speech, tremors, staggering gait, then delirium, coma, death. Fevers could spike incredibly high, maybe 108 Fahrenheit. Chills, trouble breathing.
Yeah.
Pregnant women almost always miscarried, hemorrhaged. And then there's the gangrene. Fingers, toes, nose, turning black and dying. That's likely where the name Black Death comes from.
Truly gruesome. And the death toll. We touched on it, but let's just drive home the scale again.
It's staggering. In just a few years after 1348, maybe a third of Europe's entire population gone.
A third.
But in crowded cities, much worse, 50% or more. Half of Paris's 100,000 people. Florence dropped from maybe 120,000 down to 50,000.
It's just decimated.
Hamburg, Bremen probably lost 60% or more. London, maybe similar, around 62,000 deaths estimated between 1346 and 1353.
And those Florentine tax records.
Almost unbelievable, suggesting 80% died in just 4 months in 1348.
80%.
And the aftermath. By 1450, something like 40,000 German settlements were just abandoned, empty.
Yeah, it's hard to even process that level of collapse where any place is spared or less hard hit.
Some. More isolated areas often fared better. Flanders for a while, Hainaut, Finland, parts of northern Germany, some regions in Poland.
Geography helped?
Geography, maybe lower population density. But interestingly, those caring for the sick monks, nuns, priests, they faced incredibly high risk.
It's a tragic sacrifice and a huge loss for communities.
Absolutely.
Amidst all this horror, though, we see the beginnings of public health measures. The word quarantine.
Yes, while isolating the sick wasn't totally new, the term quarantine comes from this era. In 1377, Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, made arrivals from plague areas isolate for 30 days.
A Trentino.
Exactly. Later, they extended it to 40 days. Quarantino in Italian. 40. Hence, quarantine.
A direct response, trying to contain it. And the impact wasn't just death, was it? It shook institutions, religion.
Profoundly. No institution was untouched.
Yeah.
Smaller monasteries, convents, many just couldn't survive, closed down.
Lost too many people.
Lost people, lost income. Parish churches lost priests, creating huge gaps. Some historians argue it changed religious feelings, attitudes, though that's a complex debate.
A world changed forever. But the story has these incredible echoes, doesn't it?
Right.
Let's jump forward centuries. The genetic legacy. How can scientists possibly know this?
It's amazing, really. Modern science. They can extract ancient DNA, aDNA, from teeth.
From teeth?
Teeth preserve DNA quite well. From victims buried in plague pits like East Smithfield in London, and also from skeletons in Denmark, comparing victims and likely survivors.
And they can see differences between those who lived and died.
Yes. By analyzing that ancient genetic material, they found specific genetic differences that seem to have been crucial for survival. Natural selection in action on a massive scale.
What genes are we talking about?
One key gene they pinpointed is called ERAP2.
ERAP2.
The research showed people with a specific good version, a protective allele, of this gene were 40 to 50% more likely to survive the Black Death.
40 to 50%, that's huge.
A massive survival advantage. It seems this version helped their immune systems neutralize the Yersinia pestis bacterium more efficiently.
So this wasn't just a minor evolutionary tweak.
Oh no, the researchers stressed the selection pressure, the force of evolution driven by the plague on these genes, was one of the strongest ever reported in human history.
Wow.
It shows how powerfully a single pathogen can reshape our genetic makeup, even relatively quickly.
Incredible. But here's the twist, the really fascinating part. This adaptation that helped our ancestors survive the plague, it affects us today.
Precisely. This is where it gets mind-bending. That same ERIP2 gene, the variants that were protective back then, they're now linked to an increased risk for certain autoimmune diseases. Things like Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis.
Hold on. So the gene that saved people then makes people more likely to get sick now.
That's the balancing act of evolution. What's beneficial in one environment against one threat can have downsides in another context or against different challenges later on.
That's a powerful reminder, isn't it? How interconnected our past and present biology are. A medieval disease still influencing modern health risks.
Absolutely. And this wasn't just one lab. This was a major international effort, right?
It was a big collaboration. McMaster University, University of Chicago, the Pasteur Institute, others. Took about 7 years of intensive work. Ancient DNA, genetics, bacteriology, all coming together.
Amazing science. Okay, now for the final, maybe most unexpected piece, politics. The Black Death influencing political systems centuries later. How?
It sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? But there's compelling research, particularly focused on German-speaking Central Europe.
Okay.
The core idea is the massive death toll created a huge labor shortage.
Makes sense. Fewer workers available.
Exactly. And that made things like serfdom, these repressive labor systems where peasants were tied to the land, much harder to maintain. They became economically unsustainable in many places, hit hardest by the plague. So workers suddenly had more power, more value.
Precisely. Labor scarcity gave surviving workers more leverage. They could demand better conditions, more freedom. This is theorized to have helped foster, well, call them proto-democratic institutions. More independent political cultures started developing.
And they compared this to places less affected by the plague.
Yes. In areas with lower death rates, the old social structures, the labor coercion, tended to stick around longer. And that persistence, the theory goes, hindered the development of more participatory politics. The power dynamics didn't shift as much. We have an image that maps this out visually.
And they found evidence for this. Looking at voting patterns.
Yeah.
Centuries later.
That's the really striking part. The findings suggest areas with higher Black death mortality were, over the long run, more likely to develop more inclusive political institutions, more equitable land ownership.
Okay.
And then, fast forward to the era of mass politics, voters in those historically hard-hit areas, they showed more independence from landed elites, tended to support more liberal parties over conservative ones.
But the kicker, the link to the Nazis.
This is the most astonishing finding. The research shows a statistically significant negative correlation. Meaning, areas that had suffered more intensely from the Black Death centuries earlier had lower vote shares for Hitler's National Socialist Party in the crucial Weimar elections of 1930 and July 1932.
Wait, so higher Black Death mortality way back when correlated with less support for the Nazis much later.
Exactly. The graphs illustrating this are pretty clear. It's an inverse relationship.
How could that possibly work? What's the proposed explanation?
It goes back to that earlier weakening of serfdom and labor coercion.
Right.
The idea is that this fostered a social context over centuries where ordinary people had more autonomy, a stronger sense of their own political agency, less ingrained deference to traditional authority.
Whereas in the areas less affected by the plague,
where those older hierarchies might have remained stronger, voters were perhaps more susceptible to the appeals of authoritarianism, more used to following the lead of elites.
So the Black Death, completely unintentionally, might have built a sort of long-term societal resistance to certain kinds of extremism in some regions.
That's the intriguing hypothesis, yes. But the research also notes contrasts.
It wasn't uniform.
No, look at Eastern German areas like Brandenburg, Prussia. There, the lack of strong communal self-governance after the plague actually helped pave the way for a very powerful autocratic state dominated by the Junker landowners and the military.
So the local context really mattered in shaping the long-term effects.
Absolutely. The Black Death was a massive shock, but how societies responded and rebuilt varied, leading to different historical paths.
It's just mind-boggling. A 14th century pandemic leaving fingerprints on our genes and potentially on 20th century voting patterns.
It really shows how these seemingly distant historical events can cast such incredibly long shadows, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Black Death wasn't just a temporary catastrophe, it was a catalyst. It set off chain reactions that reshaped society, biology, maybe even politics, in ways no one at the time could have ever imagined.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've seen the Black Death as this almost unimaginable disaster, killing millions, shaking society to its core.
Right.
But also leaving this permanent mark on our immune system genetics, influencing our health today.
That ERAP2 story, yeah.
And astonishingly, potentially playing a role in the long arc of political development in parts of Europe, maybe even subtly influencing resistance to extremism centuries later.
Exactly. Hopefully you listening have gained a deeper sense of just how complex and interconnected history is, how this one event touches on your biology, the political world.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What other historical crises, maybe ones we think of as completely over, might still be shaping us?
Shaping our societies, our bodies, how we interact with power.
What other unexpected legacies are hiding in the past, waiting to be uncovered? Makes you wonder.